I remember the day too clearly, because it still makes my stomach tighten when I think back to it. The woods have always been a place where I've gone for calm, for quiet, for that feeling of being swallowed up by something bigger than myself. But that trip, the one where everything changed, reminded me how quickly that calm can flip into something else entirely. Something that makes your pulse hammer in your ears and your stomach twist like you're dropping in an elevator that never stops. It was late autumn, when the leaves were dry and crisp underfoot and the air carried that cold bite that hints of winter coming soon. I had driven out to an area that was less traveled, a stretch of forest that didn't really have official campsites, but a few game trails and old logging roads that led into the deeper sections. I wanted space, no people, no noise. I left my phone in the car because I didn't want the distraction. I had my pack, a small knife, a flashlight, some food, water, and layers. I wasn't planning to stay overnight. Just a long day moving through the trees, maybe finding a ridge with a view, then coming back before dark. The first hours were simple, just walking, breathing in that raw air, watching the way the sunlight broke into pale beams through the branches overhead. I crossed through a dry creek bed, climbed a slope lined with pine and hemlock, and followed a faint trail that seemed to wind deeper than I expected. The ground was soft with years of fallen needles, and every step gave off that muffled crunch that only woods this far out can make. But after a while, that feeling of peace shifted. It wasn't a snap, not like someone flipping a switch. It was gradual. I noticed it when I stopped to drink some water. I realized I hadn't heard a bird in a long while. The forest had gone still, and that kind of silence doesn't feel normal. You expect at least some rustle, a crow calling, maybe the scamper of a squirrel. But there was nothing. Just me, my breath, and the faint creak of the trees moving with the breeze. I shook it off at first. Silence happens, but the deeper I walked, the heavier that quiet seemed to get. I began to notice small things, like the way I felt eyes on me when I crouched to tie my bootlace, or the way my shoulders kept tensing as though I was waiting for something behind me. I told myself I was just overthinking. Too many late-night stories online about people going missing in forests, or strange encounters with things best left alone. My brain was filling gaps. It wasn't until I heard the voice that the calm cracked for good. I was moving along a slope, careful on the loose soil, when it came, faint, carried through the trees. A voice. I froze. It wasn't close, not right on top of me, but it wasn't far either. Carried enough to make me stop breathing for a second. It wasn't shouting, not even raised. Just a tone, like someone humming words out loud, or maybe speaking to themselves. The sound drifted in and then faded, like it had been cut off. My stomach dropped hard. I wasn't expecting anyone out here. This wasn't a marked trail, wasn't a park full of people. It was the sort of place you only found if you wanted to be alone. So why was there someone? I stood still, straining my ears, waiting for it to come again. Nothing, just the dead silence of the woods. The sound had been odd, not jolly, not really friendly, but not sharp or angry either. Just strange. Like the tone someone uses when they're practicing talking, but without caring who hears. I thought about calling out, but something in me shut that down instantly. I didn't want whoever it was to know where I was. I didn't want them to hear my voice at all. My body reacted before my brain did. My legs bent, my shoulders hunched, and I found myself lowering to the ground behind a tree. I crouched there for what felt like forever, eyes darting across the trees, waiting for movement. My pulse wouldn't settle. I kept expecting to see someone step into view, maybe carrying something, maybe smiling, maybe staring. But nobody came. After a while, I forced myself up and started moving again. But I didn't take the same direction I had been on. I shifted, cut sideways down toward the creek bed I had passed earlier. I didn't want to be on any kind of trail if someone else was. I wanted to lose myself in the thickest part of the woods. Every step I took felt watched, though. The silence wasn't letting up, and that unease in my gut kept twisting tighter. I walked faster, trying not to make too much noise, but also desperate to put distance between me and whatever that was. Then it came again. The voice. Same tone. Faint, but closer this time. Not close enough that I could make out words, if there even were words, but close enough to make my skin crawl. Came from upslope, maybe 50 yards away. Carried, wove through the trunks, and then stopped again. I froze with my back against a tree, every muscle rigid. The thought of being seen by whoever was making that sound was like ice down my spine. I didn't know if they were alone. I didn't know what they wanted, but nothing about it felt right. Nobody sane or safe wanders this deep into nowhere and starts talking like that. I moved again, quicker this time. Downhill, cutting through brush, stumbling on roots and rocks but pushing forward. I didn't care about the path anymore. My goal was to get back to the car. Every sound I made felt like it was announcing me, but stopping felt worse. For a while, I thought maybe I'd left it behind. Maybe the person had just been some hunter or camper who happened to be out here too. But then, faintly, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, the sound slipped back through the trees. My throat was dry. I hadn't had water since before I heard it the first time. I couldn't make myself stop to drink. My whole body was locked in that fight or flight state, leaning on flight with everything I had. My boots slid on pine needles, snapped twigs underfoot, but I didn't slow. I don't know how long it went on like that. The forest all looked the same, endless brown and green, trunks stretching up into gray sky. I tried to keep my sense of direction, but I couldn't be sure anymore. I was tired, my legs burned, and panic was making my head light. At one point, I swore I saw movement in the trees above me. Just a shift, like someone slipping behind a trunk when I glanced that way. I didn't stay to check. I bolted downslope until my legs gave out and I dropped to my knees on damp leaves. It was then that I realized something terrifying. I couldn't hear my own footsteps anymore. I had stopped, but the silence wasn't empty. There was the faintest crunch. Not mine. Off to the left, maybe 20 yards. Slow, careful. Like someone placing their feet just enough to move, but not enough to be obvious. My chest locked tight. Couldn't breathe right. I stayed crouched, hands pressed into the dirt, listening as the sound came again. One step, then nothing, then another. I don't know what gave me the strength to move. Maybe the sheer force of knowing I had to. I scrambled up and pushed myself forward, not caring how loud I was anymore. I just needed to put distance between me and that sound. The forest felt endless, but eventually, I recognized the creek bed again. Relief surged through me, messy and overwhelming. If I could find the slope I had climbed earlier, I could trace my way back. I didn't stop to rest, didn't look behind me. The last stretch was a blur. Climbing, stumbling, running until my legs were jelly. And then, finally, the faint glint of metal through the trees. My car. I don't think I've ever felt anything like that relief. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys the first time I tried to unlock the door. I yanked it open, threw myself inside, and slammed the locks down. My chest hurt from breathing so hard, but I couldn't stop. I started the engine with shaking fingers and pulled out faster than I should have, gravel spitting under the tires. The whole drive back, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. Half of me expected to see someone step out of the tree line, watching as I left. But there was nothing, just the woods, quiet and heavy, shrinking in the distance. When I finally made it home, the silence in my house felt unreal, safe. But even now, years later, the memory crawls back at night when everything is still. The sound of that voice, drifting without care, not friendly, not angry, just wrong. And the slow crunch of footsteps in the dead quiet woods. That day taught me something I'll never forget. The forest is beautiful, but it can swallow you up without a trace. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing out there isn't an animal or the weather. It's another person, someone whose reasons for being there don't line up with yours. I haven't gone that deep into the woods alone again, and I never will. When I think back to my childhood, a lot of the memories blur together, especially the family camping trips. But there's one that stands out sharper than the rest. It's not the kind of memory that warms you or makes you smile. It's the kind that sinks in and twists years later, when you realize what it really meant. I was about 5 years old. My parents used to camp out in the bush every year with a few families they were close with. It was always a mix of adults and kids, tents lined up in a rough circle, a big fire in the middle, and coolers stacked with food. To me, back then, it felt like a big adventure. The kids ran around barefoot, covered in dust and scratches, while the adults laughed and drank around the fire. That particular year, it was around Christmas, which felt strange because instead of lights on houses or carols playing in stores, there were cicadas buzzing in the trees and the dry crackle of leaves under our feet. There were 9 kids in total, ranging from me, the youngest, to a couple of teenagers who mostly wanted nothing to do with us. I remember how free it felt. We were allowed to wander the bush nearby, as long as we stayed together in groups and didn't go too far. The parents gave us one of the walkie-talkies to carry so they could call us back when it was time to eat. It was like our lifeline to the camp, but to us kids, it was more like a toy. I can still see us that afternoon, a cluster of kids stumbling through the undergrowth, pushing sticks into dirt, pretending we were explorers or hunters. The sun was hot, the air dry, and our shadows stretched long across the ground. None of us were paying attention to time. We weren't thinking about danger, not at that age. The bush was just trees and bugs and the occasional rabbit darting across a clearing. We had the walkie-talkie with us, and we'd take turns pressing the button and pretending to report back like we were on some mission. Usually it was just static when we let go of the button, maybe the faint sound of a parent's voice if they were checking in. Nothing unusual, until that one time. I remember it so clearly because of how strange it felt. Out of nowhere, the static cut, and a man's voice came through. It wasn't anyone from camp. It wasn't a voice I knew. It was low, kind of rough, and it said something that made all of us freeze. He said he was Santa. He said he was looking for us, that he wanted to bring us our presents, and that we should try to find him. At 5 years old, that lit me up inside. I didn't think about how wrong it was. I didn't think about how nobody should be talking to us on that channel. To me, at that age, Santa was real enough, and now he was talking to me through the radio. I looked at the older kids, expecting them to grin and believe too. Some of the younger ones were as excited as me, eyes wide, faces lit up. But I remember the older ones looking unsettled. They didn't laugh. They didn't say it was a joke. They just went quiet, all of them staring at the walkie like it had done something it wasn't supposed to. But being kids, we didn't really stop to think. We got excited. We started running back toward camp, shouting about Santa, waving the walkie-talkie. We thought we'd found something magical. When we got back, the adults didn't share our excitement. I remember how quickly the mood shifted when the walkie-talkie was handed over. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. The adults' faces changed. The laughter around the fire dulled. The walkie was switched off, set aside, and the rules changed in an instant. We weren't allowed to leave camp anymore, not even in groups. At the time, I remember feeling angry, cheated. I thought we'd ruined the fun. I thought maybe the older kids had spoiled it by looking so serious, or that the adults just didn't want us to have our own adventure anymore. I didn't see the bigger picture. But now, as an adult looking back, I can't stop my stomach from dropping every time I think about it. That voice wasn't Santa. It was a man somewhere out in that bush, close enough to pick up the same channel, listening, waiting. He knew there were kids out there. He knew we had a walkie-talkie, and he knew how to bait us. I think about the way he said it, too. At the time, it didn't strike me as odd. But remembering it now, it wasn't jolly. It wasn't playful. It was flat, too deliberate, like someone putting on a mask, forcing a voice that didn't fit. There was no warmth in it, just words aimed directly at us. The more I replay it, the more it chills me. That man had to be close. Radios like that don't reach far in thick bush. He wasn't miles away, he was nearby, within walking distance. Maybe he'd seen us. Maybe he was watching as we stumbled through the undergrowth, unaware. Maybe he thought we'd come looking for him, just like he asked. And we would have. If the voice had come through a second time, urging us to wander further, I don't doubt that we would have followed. We were kids. The idea of Santa waiting in the trees with presents was enough to override any sense of caution. The parents never told us much more about it. They brushed it off, said it was nothing, but their actions spoke louder. They tightened everything after that. No more wandering, no more walkies in the kids' hands. I think they didn't want to scare us, but I know they were scared. The real weight of it didn't hit me until I was much older. I realized how easily that day could have gone differently. How 9 kids, scattered in the bush, could have been lured off the track by a stranger who knew exactly what to say. How maybe, just maybe, one of us wouldn't have made it back. I think about how much trust we had in the walkie-talkie. It was our line to safety, but it also became the door that someone else walked through. A stranger reaching into our small world, using our own lifeline against us. That's the part that still unsettles me most. Now, whenever I hear static on a radio, or a voice crackling through unexpectedly, my chest tightens. Takes me back to that day, to the dry air, the dust under my feet, the sudden shift from excitement to unease, to the realization that someone was out there, in the trees, speaking directly to a group of kids who had no idea what kind of danger we were in. We never camped the same way again after that. The adults always stayed closer, the kids never roamed as freely. At the time, I hated it. I thought the fun had been stolen from us. But now I see it for what it was, protection. They'd glimpsed something dark, and they weren't about to risk it twice. I've gone camping many times since as an adult. I love the outdoors, the quiet, the way the forest wraps around you. But every single time, when night falls and the static of a walkie or a radio buzzes through the air, I can't stop myself from listening for that voice. The flat, deliberate voice of a man pretending to be Santa, somewhere in the bush, close enough to reach us. And I know, without a doubt, that if the parents hadn't acted the way they did, that trip might have ended very differently. What felt like disappointment back then was actually the thing that kept us safe. That's the part that stays with me most all these years later. The understanding of how thin the line is between a normal childhood memory and something that could have turned into a nightmare none of us would have ever come back from. When I think back to my childhood, camping is one of those things that feels like it defined big chunks of who I was growing up. It was routine for my family, something we did almost every year, usually with the same group of family friends. The smell of campfire smoke clinging to clothes, the way dirt always seemed to cake under your fingernails no matter how much you rinsed your hands in cold creek water, the sound of laughter carrying across a dark campsite, those were the normal markers of my early years. But one trip, when I was still young enough to only half understand what was going on, stands out in a way the others don't. I've replayed it countless times in my head since then, especially as I got older and finally recognized what had really been happening. I was maybe 5 or 6 years old at the time. It was summer, and instead of doing the normal thing of staying home during Christmas holidays, our families decided to spend it camping out in the bush. There were several families all together, all friends, so it was a big crowd. A dozen adults or so, and 9 kids in total, ranging from me at the youngest up to some who were already teens and thought they were too old to hang out with the rest of us. Our campsite was set back in the bush. No fancy caravan park, no powered sites, just a clearing where tents could be pitched and a fire pit dug. It wasn't far from a dry creek bed, and the land stretched out in all directions with low scrub and taller gums scattered thick enough that once you stepped away from camp, the world quickly felt bigger, quieter, heavier. For the kids, it was heaven. No fences, no streets, no rules beyond the simple ones laid down by the parents. Don't go too far, stick together, and keep the walkie-talkie with you. That was the big one. The walkie-talkies were the parents' way of keeping a line of control. They had one and we had the other. We were allowed to wander into the trees as long as we checked in, and when they called us back, we came back. It gave us freedom while giving them peace of mind. At the time, the walkie-talkie felt more like a toy than a safety tool. We'd fight over who got to carry it, who got to press the button, who got to hear the crackle of static. It felt like we had a secret link to the adult world, and sometimes we'd even pretend we were explorers or soldiers, reporting back in serious voices. It was fun, harmless, and a way for us to stretch the leash a little. That afternoon, we were in one of those wandering groups. The sun was high and sharp, the kind of heat that makes the ground smell dry and the air shimmer above the dirt. Cicadas buzzed in waves, rising and falling until you almost didn't notice it anymore. The group of us kids drifted through the scrub, pushing sticks into the soil, climbing fallen logs, daring each other to jump across little gaps in the dry creek bed. We were scattered but still within sight of each other, laughing and chasing. That's when the voice came through. It was so sudden and unexpected that we all froze. Static cracked, then cleared, and a man's voice came over the walkie. It wasn't anyone we knew. It wasn't one of the dads, and it wasn't one of the moms checking in. It was a stranger's voice, low and rough, but trying to put on a tone that was supposed to sound cheerful. He said he was Santa. He said he was out there in the bush looking for us, that he had presents, and that we should look for him. At that age, the words alone were enough to make my heart leap. Santa was still real in my mind. The idea of him not just existing, but speaking directly to me through the walkie-talkie felt like magic. I remember my eyes widening, my little chest swelling with excitement. I glanced at the older kids, expecting to see the same awe on their faces. But their expressions were different, confused, uneasy. Some of them frowned, some shifted uncomfortably, but none of them laughed or smiled. They didn't buy it, not for a second. They recognized something I couldn't yet, something off in the tone, something that didn't sit right. Still, being kids, we all bolted back to camp. We were shouting over each other, tripping on roots, yelling about how Santa had spoken to us. Felt like we'd stumbled into a secret no one else knew. When we spilled into camp waving the walkie, the adults didn't react the way I thought they would. I expected surprise, maybe laughter, maybe even a game to follow along. Instead, their faces went hard. They took the walkie out of our hands, turned it off, and that was the end of it. No more wandering, no more freedom. We were told to stay in camp for the rest of the trip. At the time, we were devastated. We sulked, complained, whispered to each other about how unfair it was. We didn't understand why our parents were suddenly so strict. To us, it seemed like they were ruining the fun for no reason. But now, looking back with adult eyes, it's obvious why. That wasn't a game. That wasn't one of the parents testing us. If it had been, they would have told us later, or at the very least, they would have let us have the walkie again on the next trip. But they didn't. From that day forward, kids didn't carry the walkies anymore. And we were never allowed into the bush alone again. Not that trip, not any trip after that. Every time we camped from then on, if a group of kids wanted to go for a walk, at least one adult came too. Always. No exceptions. At the time, I thought it was just strictness, parents being overprotective. But now I know better. That voice hadn't been theirs. It had been a man out there in the bush, close enough to pick up the same channel, close enough to hear kids playing. A man who knew there were children within range and who tried to lure them deeper, away from the safety of the camp, by pretending to be someone every child trusted. And the part that haunts me most is how easily it could have worked. If he'd spoken again, if he'd given directions, I think some of us would have followed. Kids don't weigh risk the way adults do. At that age, the idea of Santa waiting in the trees was enough to make our small hearts race with excitement. It would have only taken one or two of us starting to wander, and the rest would have gone along. The adults never spelled it out for us, but their actions told the truth. They weren't testing us. They were frightened. Frightened enough to change the way camping worked for the rest of our childhoods. Now, when I think about that trip, my stomach sinks. The air that day had been so normal. Cicadas, dry grass, laughter, and then, suddenly, there was a predator's voice slipping into our small world, baiting us, trying to draw us in. Not a monster, not anything supernatural. Just a man hiding in the bush with a walkie tuned to our frequency, waiting for children to answer. It's the ordinariness of it that makes it terrifying. Every time I hold a walkie-talkie now, or hear the crackle of static, it brings that memory back. The way my parents' faces shifted when they realized what we'd heard. The way we were corralled after that, not allowed even a sliver of the freedom we'd had before. At the time I hated it, thought it was unfair. Now I see it for what it was. Them pulling us back from the edge of something we didn't even know we were standing on. I'll never forget how quickly things changed after that day. And I'll never forget the lesson hidden inside it. The scariest things in the deep woods aren't shadows or wild animals. They're people. People who know how to twist trust into bait. People who wait for the right moment, watching from where you can't see. That Christmas camping trip could have ended very differently. And I'm grateful every day that it didn't. I've had plenty of close calls in life, But the one that still sits with me most is the day I almost lost the mother of my kids. It didn't even happen deep in the wilderness or on some remote peak. It was supposed to be a calm trip, just a hike near the coast followed by a swim to cool off. It started simple, normal, something we'd done before without giving it too much thought. But that day turned into one of those moments where everything felt fragile, where all the little choices I had made stacked up into something I could never take back if it had gone differently. We had been hiking a coastal trail, the kind where the path runs along the cliffs and the sound of the ocean is always in the background, steady and endless. The air smelled of salt, and the sun was beating down harder than I expected for the season. It had been my idea to make the trip light. No need to bring phones, no need to weigh down our packs, just water, some snacks, and a towel or two if we decided to go in the water. It felt freeing at the time, leaving the constant buzzing of the world behind, letting ourselves just exist out there in the open without being tied to screens. Looking back, I can't shake how stupid that decision was, how costly it could have been. After hours on the trail, we reached this small inlet where the sand curved like a crescent, tucked between rocky shoulders that broke the waves before they crashed in. It looked calm from the cliffs above, almost inviting. We'd been sweating, tired, and the idea of getting in the water felt like relief. We sat on the beach for a while, catching our breath. I remember watching her slip the ring I had just given her the day before off her finger and press it into my palm. She said she didn't want to lose it in the water, and I tucked it into my pocket without thinking too much about it. It felt almost symbolic, the trust in that small action, handing me the thing I had just promised meant forever. We waded in slowly at first, laughing at how cold it felt compared to the heat of the day. The water bit at our skin, but after a few minutes it was refreshing, almost soothing. She swam out a little further than me, always braver in the water than I was. I stayed closer to shore, bobbing in the swell, keeping her in sight. The waves didn't look bad. Nothing about the place screamed danger, but that's how it always is. Things look fine until suddenly they're not. At first, I thought she was just floating, letting the current carry her, but then I saw the way she started to kick harder. She wasn't coming closer to shore. Each stroke looked like it should be pulling her back in, but the distance between us kept growing. She tried again, harder this time, her arms cutting against the water, but she didn't move forward at all. That was the moment I understood. A riptide. I felt this cold rush of panic hit me, heavier than the water itself. I tried to swim toward her, pushing through the waves, but every yard I gained felt like a battle. Salt stung my eyes and my mouth, but I kept going, telling myself I just had to get close enough to reach her hand, close enough to pull. But the water wasn't letting me. It felt like the ocean had a grip on both of us, dragging us further out whether we wanted it or not. She started to struggle harder, her movements turning frantic. I could see her head dipping lower between strokes, her arms flailing, and for the first time it hit me that she might not make it. I pushed harder, but the more I tried, the more I knew the truth. I wasn't strong enough. If I went any further, I'd be pulled under too. I could feel it in my legs, the exhaustion setting in, the drag pulling at my body. My lungs were already burning, my muscles screaming. I had to stop, had to float just long enough to catch my breath, but every second I wasted meant she was going under. That was the hardest moment of my life. I had to choose between risking everything to get closer, knowing I'd likely become another body in the water, or holding back and watching her drown. The thought of leaving her alone out there, of letting her slip under while I stayed helpless, was unbearable. I even thought about just going anyway, letting myself be pulled with her so she wouldn't die alone. It was this sick, heavy thought that pressed down on me. What was the point of surviving if I had to live knowing I'd watched her go under without even being there? But something in me froze, couldn't go. My body knew it before my mind did. I was at my limit. If I went any further, we would both be gone. I shouted, but my voice carried nowhere in the crash of the surf. There was no one around, no lifeguards, no families on the beach, no one walking by with a phone. We had left ours in the car way up the trail, thinking we didn't need them. I felt the weight of that choice crushing down on me. I treaded water, eyes locked on her as she fought. She went under once, came back up gasping, coughing, choking on seawater. I could see the fear in her movements, the desperation. My chest felt like it was splitting open watching her sink lower each time she resurfaced. I started swimming along the shore, not out but sideways, hoping maybe I could angle closer without fighting the pull directly. It bought me a little ground, but not enough. Then something happened I still don't fully understand. The ocean shifted. It was like the tide that had been pulling her away suddenly lost its grip just enough. She drifted sideways, not toward me but closer to the rocks that jutted out from the beach. Her head bobbed up, her arms weak, but she was moving toward where the waves broke shallower. I kicked harder, desperate to close the gap, salt burning my throat with each gasp. I reached out as her body rolled with the swell, her face barely above the surface. My hand caught her arm. She was limp, heavy, the fight drained out of her. I dragged with everything I had, pulling her toward the shallows, stumbling as the waves slammed against my back. My legs were jelly, my chest heaving like I'd been suffocated, but I didn't let go. Inch by inch we made it, until the water was low enough for me to half carry, half drag her onto the wet sand. She was coughing, choking, her body shaking uncontrollably. For a moment I thought she wasn't breathing, that I'd been too late, but then she spit out water and gasped. Relief hit me so hard my knees buckled. I knelt beside her, holding her hand, listening to the ragged sound of her breaths. She was alive, barely but alive. Somewhere behind us, voices called out. A couple walking along the beach had seen us, and they came running. They had a phone. They called for help while I stayed there, holding her, feeling the warmth of her skin slowly coming back against the cold. By some miracle, the ocean had spat her back close enough for me to reach. If it hadn't, if those people hadn't walked by, if any one thing had gone differently, I would have lost her that day. Later, at the hospital, I pulled the ring from my pocket. It was still there, still safe. I stared at it for a long time, turning it over in my hand while she lay hooked to monitors, her chest rising and falling shallow but steady. That ring almost became the last piece of her I would have had. I never forgot that moment. The helplessness, the guilt of not being able to go further, the sickening thought of nearly losing her one day after promising forever. I've avoided the ocean since. It looks different to me now, not peaceful, not inviting, just vast and merciless. Every time I see it, I think of her slipping under, of how close it came, and I think of the choice I had to make, the line where survival ends and love pushes you to the edge. We were lucky that day. I know plenty of people aren't. The ocean doesn't care who you are or what you love. It takes when it wants. And every time I look at her now, I'm reminded that we got a second chance we never should have had.